Fellow students of globalization. Today we are going to be continuing our road to the present through the pre-modern era of globalization. And today it may seem like we're going to be a bit Western-centric because we're going to focus really in on two aspects of European culture and from when European culture began to really push outwards in a way that is tangible and that forever transformed the world. And we're going to be asking ourselves a few questions about why this happened. And we're going to be looking at a reading within our class that is from Jared Diamond's great work, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And we're going to ask why the West? How did the West, this kind of backwater region of the world in Europe, go from in 1300 being the least urban, the least likely that would come to dominate the world. If you stood on a high mountain in the year 1300 and I asked you to survey the world, where would you have guessed that the dominant hegemonic power would come from? No one in their right mind would have said, oh, this tiny island out in the middle of the North Atlantic that's separated from Europe. Nobody would have said England, Great Britain, is going to become the greatest industrial power the world had ever seen. And everybody would have said China. Maybe some would have said India. You might even argue that the Middle East would have been where this great change would have occurred, because these places were filled with large cities, with sophisticated thinkers, with wealth, with trade, and it didn't happen. So we have to ask ourselves, why the West? And so this is our rationale for really looking at Europe throughout these next two lectures, and how Europe was able to transform itself into the dominant culture, and why I'm lecturing to you in English and not Mandarin. So let us begin by looking at the Age of Exploration, which is really from around the year 1400 and goes through 1600. And when we're looking at explorers and this notion of exploration, we have to think, why did Europeans decide to travel all over the world? Why were they in need of finding new routes to China? Why did they have to do this and other places didn't? Well, they were poor to begin with. Other than producing a little bit of cloth and sheep and the odd bit of grain, Europe really had nothing that the world wanted. So they had to trade in precious metals, and therefore they had to find a way in order to get the luxury goods they wanted that were coming from the Far East and India and all over the Orient. I'm going to be using this word, the Orient. It's kind of old-fashioned, but I think it really encapsulates what the region that I want to talk about. And this was the goal, was to get to the Orient for Europeans, that they wanted the things that were in the Orient, and therefore they had to. They also had a earnest desire to spread their religion. They wanted other people to be Christians like them. It was part of this faith that they had, and I think that this is often overlooked, but it was definitely a part of their rationale. And furthermore, they wanted the fame of it. This was a competition. Who could be the first person to get to China, to get to India? They wanted to know how this was this possible? Could they do this? I think there's something in the human condition that just loves to explore the beyond. And this was part of it, the adventure, the exploration of it. So Europeans had long been adventurers. We will turn our attention far back in time to the time of the Vikings and the great explorer Leif Erikson, who found his way all the way from Norway to Iceland in the 9th century. And these Northmen were able to sail basically in little more than a canoe and one sail, but they would row throughout the North Atlantic, navigating by a little more than the stars. And they found their way all the way to North America, even setting up a colony in Vinland in Canada for a very short time. So there had been a long history of adventuring in European mentalities. Europeans were not alone in their lust to explore the world. That during the 15th century, the great Chinese admiral Xing He was charged with going on a mission of exploration, that he would find knowledge and that he would find new trading posts, that he would go on this grand adventure from China all over the Orient, throughout Indonesia, the isles of the many islands of Indonesia, throughout India, and all the way to East Africa and return. And he sought to bring wealth, but he also sought to bring knowledge, that the emperors wanted to know more about the world, and they wanted to establish contacts with these civilizations that were far, far away, and to expand. And eventually China, after this great mission of discovery, turns inward, that they decide after this that they're just simply going to be quite content with their own civilization. Nobody has anything that they can't. They are the greatest civilization on earth, and why look outward when you can look inward, when you already are the best and everyone has what you want, or what you have. Apart from China, we see these Polynesian cultures throughout would be the Pacific, and they were able to perform these incredible feats, that they would sail from Fiji and Tahiti, Hawaii, that they sailed across all these big islands throughout the Pacific, and eventually found their way to South America on nothing more than basically a couple canoes tied together and a sail. So it's very incredible what human beings are capable of as they decide to adventure out, to go where we have never gone before. Now, as we say, we have to look at sort of the perspective on exploration. Europeans at the time of the late 15th century really wanted to get to the Orient. They wanted the luxury items, as I was saying, the silks, the spices, the teas, these wonderful things that were made in the East that they had no ability to make or grow or keep. They wanted to get to the Orient. They wanted these things. They wanted to get past the Italian and Muslim middlemen and not have to pay extremely high prices. They sort of wanted to cut out the middle guy, and they wanted to be able to afford these things and get a lot more of them. Moreover, they wanted to prove their own theories, that they believed that there were routes to get around Africa, and they believed that there were ways to get to the East that they had not yet discovered. So there were many attempts at trying to find ways to the Orient, and some succeeded, some did not succeed, but eventually it was discovered that you could circumnavigate the world, that the world, you could go all the way around and end up back in Europe. And the original thinker of this was Prince Henry the Navigator from Portugal. And he founded a very prestigious college of navigation and cartography. And the great questions that these guys were asking, these people, these voyagers, they wanted to know, is Africa infinite? Africa is larger than China, the United States, and Canada all put together. It's huge. It's a huge continent. And they wondered if you could sail around Africa, or whether it was just an endless landmass that that had no end. And could you go around Africa? And then how could you do this? Well, you needed to perfect the caravel, which was their main trading ship, their means of transport. And eventually, finally, one of the members of this college, an adventurer named Bartholomew Diaz, he discovers you can go around the Cape of Good Hope. Indeed, Africa has an end, and you can get around. And then that Vasco da Gama, shortly after this, from the knowledge of Diaz, sails around the Good Hope and finds the Orient. He brings back a ship that is loaded down. He avoids all the merchants from Italy and the Islamic world. If you went through the Mediterranean, you had to pay the merchants who already had connections in the East. And his ship, the amount of money he made was 60 times what the cost of the voyage was before he set out. So there was great financial impetus in order to be able to go to the Orient. Now, as time went on, after Columbus discovers the New World, there becomes a rivalry between Portugal and Spain. And how do they stop a war from happening between these two great powers, these exploring powers? Well, the Pope intervenes, right? This great international organization called the Church. The leader of this institution brings the leaders of Spain and Portugal together, who are a part of this globalized trading network, and the Pope draws a line right down a map of the world, and this is called the Treaty of Tortosia. And everything on the right of the map is Portugal's, and everything on the left of the map is Spain's. So effectively, if you ever ask yourself, why do they speak Portuguese in Brazil and they speak Spanish everywhere else in Latin America? Well, it's because of the Treaty of Tortosia. The Portuguese got Brazil, and Spain got everywhere else. So when you look at this map, it's kind of humorous that this is why the world is kind of the way it is. But nevertheless, because of this, these adventurers, and because of this international connection, and because the Pope just says, "I'm going to draw a line down the map. You get everything here. You get everything there." This is why the world kind of works the way it does. So Christopher Columbus, who is a very famous Italian, he gets his voyage he believed, he had a crazy theory. Everybody else wanted to go around Africa, but it's a very, very long voyage. And Columbus, he was in some ways a genius, but he was not a mathematical genius, because he had calculated that you could indeed sail to the Orient by, instead of going east and going around Africa, that you could go west. And he miscalculated by quite a bit. And he was, I think, about 6,000 miles short or something of that nature of the actual geographical distance. But nevertheless, he bumbled into the New World, and he felt that he had reached India. Almost certainly Columbus realized after his first voyage he indeed had not actually made it to India, but nevertheless he wanted to kind of perpetuate this myth. But he never comes out and says, "I never discovered the Orient," but he dies claiming that he had. Whether he actually knew this or he didn't, it's unsure. Apart from Columbus, there were other adventurers that come after him, and one of these is Vasco da Balboa, who officially confirms that the Americas, the new continents discovered, the islands in the Caribbean that were discovered by Columbus on his several voyages, that these were not the Orient, that indeed you were going to have to go a different way to find the Pacific, that you were going to have to go farther in order to find China. And he discovers a route by going around South America. Ferdinand Magellan, who finally, after learning from what Balboa had learned, is able to successfully circumnavigate the world, or at least his body is, because he dies on the voyage. But his ship, he starts out with 5, only 1 ship returns, but nevertheless, he does prove that it is possible to sail around the world and return to Europe. It takes a really, really long time, and it's much easier. It ends up going around Africa. But nevertheless, the New World is discovered here. There's a immense civilization, 50 million people that occupy these 2 continents and Caribbean islands that had never been part of the old world. And one of the most curious things is that these people were not Christians. And it raised major theological questions about the absolute knowledge of God that was delivered through the revealed religion of Christianity to Europeans. This becomes very problematic within their thinking. But there is still an effort that they wish to Christianize these people, that they have been charged with delivering the faith to them. But these cultures were not just a backward civilization scratching their living off the rocks. Rather, they were enormously wealthy civilizations. The Inca, the Maya, the Aztec, they had palaces ordained with gold, with sophisticated tools and techniques. They had not been able to create steel yet, and they did not have writing. But within their culture, there was trade throughout the Americas. We see Aztec items all the way down the coast of the Incas in South America, in current day Peru, and we see a highly interconnected world that was trade was occurring, warfare was occurring, the exchange of ideas was happening among these people, and the Europeans throw in their hat too, that they begin to participate within this culture initially, and then later it becomes highly exploitive, and we only really have the European perspective on this because there is no alphabetic writing that existed in the New World. Rather, they have some kind of pictographic writing, and we can try to understand what archaeology will tell us and what is left of their civilization, but we really just have to try to hash out what we know from the writings of the conquerors rather than the conquered. But nevertheless, that is to say that this was a highly sophisticated urban culture with very large cities, metropolises even, that were exchanging goods regionally, locally, and even internationally throughout their region of the New World. And speaking to this, and we're going to talk more about that when we begin discussing imperialism, but Spain and Portugal go from being exploradores to conquistadors, right? From explorers to conquerors. And Hernan Cortez famously conquers the Aztecs. However, you could hardly say that 300 or 400 Spaniards would be able to conquer the 10,000 person armies that were among the Aztecs, but rather Hernan Cortez was probably the luckiest man who ever lived, in that he found a kind of princess native guide who could speak many languages, including his own, after a bit of training, whose name was Melitzin, and she was able to convince other civilizations such as the Thalaxians to fight against the Aztecs, and the Spaniards were really used as sort of a shock force, shock troops that were able to just use their horses, their steel, their guns at just the perfect times in battle to turn the tide. And this is what made them successful, was the use of diplomacy in conquering the Aztecs rather than their own strength of arms. And also within this, the Aztecs were a highly exploitive empire, and most other tribal groups hated them. So they were only too happy to help the Spanish defeat the Aztecs. Um, and this is where Jared Diamond's argument comes in that guns, germs, and steel were allowed the West to conquer this vast and huge civilization in such a quick period of time. And disease certainly played an enormous role. It absolutely decimated the native populations, that they go from 50 million at the point of discovery in 1490 to 200 years later, 5 million. So through a period of exploitive slavery that the Europeans, as more and more Europeans come over, the natives are decimated by disease, and then, of course, the Europeans enslaved the natives, the Europeans seeing themselves as culturally superior. But there was a massive exchange of ideas and goods and relationships within this time. This is also the golden age of piracy in this time of the world, and this is the original Wild West, if you will. And the Spanish and really the Spanish and the Portuguese, to a lesser extent, were able to seize these mines that they had claimed. They claimed all the land, of course, because of the Treaty of Tortosia, and they were able to go in and take these mines, all this wealth, this vast wealth of the New World that was gold and silver and precious jewels, and they would ship it back to Spain. And unluckily for the English, the French, the Dutch, they did not get part of this land because the powerful Pope had already given it all to Spain. So what did they do? Well, they legalized piracy. They said, we're gonna find our best young men, and we're going to give you a license. We're going to give you a piece of paper that says it is legal for you to pillage all Spanish ships. And we'll call you a privateer, and you can be quite patriotic and go out and fight for England and France, and you can keep a certain portion of the profits, the vast majority, and then you're going to give 10-20% back to the English crown or the Dutch crown, the French crown, whatever it might be. So within the Caribbean, this is the kind of the golden age of piracy. When you think of the Pirates of the Caribbean films, this is the time period that they're just a lawless group of vagabond men with all vying for their own ships. And in the event that Spain or England signed a treaty that they were not at war with each other, well, then a privateer, your license has expired. But how would you know that until months and months afterwards? So you just become a pirate. So this is really a lawless, wild region of the world where many great stories and tales are told of the swashbuckling buccaneers of the Caribbean. So Spain falls from power. Spain really comes to the fore during the 16th century, and they're able to generate enormous profits from their exploitation of the New World. That they're bringing all this bullion, this gold and silver into the New World, but they never made any investments really in their own society. They just bought a lot of stuff. They caused enormous inflation in their economy. Right, this is the first case of really being a massive international inflation within Europe, based upon bringing in so much precious metal into Spain that moves into regional economies within Europe. But it all flows into China because it causes massive inflation in China as well. Because what do the Chinese want that Europe has? Well, the only thing that they'll take is precious metals. Europe has nothing China wants, and Europe wants everything that China has. So it causes inflation and destabilizes the world economy by the exploitation of the New World. Now, England, the Dutch really are able to profit in ways that Spain does not. They're able to seize a few islands here or there, a few pieces of land, and they are able to create colonies instead of just exploitive practices where they just take metal, they conquer, they seize things. Spain gets into the colonial game way later than do the English and the Dutch, and they successfully set up agricultural plantations where they were able to produce sugar, to produce tobacco, and these cash crops, and they are able to bring that back to Europe, and they're able to trade it highly successfully. Whereas Spain did not do that. They just they really pillaged and pilfered the local civilizations and just brought back the gold bullion and not invested in agricultural operations. As part of this is what we call the Colombian Exchange. And this is where goods from the New World go into the Old World, and goods from the Old World go into the New World. And this is most famous probably for foodstuffs, right? Yet one can hardly imagine Italian food without tomatoes. But surprise, surprise, it's a New World crop. So before 1500, there was no tomato sauce in Italian cooking. So it only goes back so far. One can hardly think of Ireland without potatoes. Surprise, surprise, it's a New World crop as well. But the real key big-time crops is sugarcane and tobacco. And this is what makes massive amounts of money on the agricultural front. Now, horses were at this time introduced into the New World. One thinks of the American Plains Indians, Native Americans who basically lived on horseback. Well, they didn't really establish this until the 1600s, at least, because there were no horses in the Americas until then. Disease is part of this exchange, and new ideas that drove Enlightenment rationality are also part of this. When you discover 60 million people who are not Christians, it makes you think. Maybe there's just sort of one deistic God that organizes everything, and all religions are just kind of created equal, but there is sort of an intelligent designer. So deism, enlightenment, the rationality comes out of this exchange as well. And again, just to stress that the English and Dutch found companies. They are very good at creating private industries that are able to come in and promote their cash crops, and they're able to successfully deliver commerce to the world through their ships, and this is the birth of kind of the English, the British Empire, and they're able to create the colonial model, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But the Dutch and the English get into conflicts over their competing colonial interests, and eventually the English went out and formed the British Empire. Now we must turn back time for just a moment, and we will look at the period of the Protestant Reformation and the wars of religion. So what is going on in the Reformation world in Europe at the same time as all this exploration? Well, there's a massive and systemic change in religious ideas that the Protestant churches are born out of this time period that Martin Luther in 1517 nails his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany, and starts a revolution in thinking. And what do they question? Well, they question the authority of the papacy, but they also question how the faith works and who has the ability to determine this question. Authority is what the great question is about. Ultimately, who is in charge of Christendom? And how does one know this? And eventually, Catholicism is going to say that the Pope has ultimate authority. And Protestants are going to say, well, this is vested in the individual. That the individual, rather than an external force, has the ability to determine one's own salvation journey to get back to God. That you don't need a pope or a church to mediate the faith for you. Really, it is just between you and God. And this is stressing this kind of very individualistic thinking that comes out of this time that will come into the Enlightenment and this Enlightenment rationality, where the individual becomes so important. The self becomes part of the intellectual universe in a way that it just never had been really before. And within this Protestant Reformation, within this Reformation period, there is the birth of the nation state. And we can really see this most clearly within England. And King Henry VIII made England England, really, out of the Reformation. He desperately wanted to marry a woman who was Anne Boleyn. And he was already married, however, to Princess Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, and the Pope refused to grant Henry a divorce. So all the king's horses and all the king's men tried to get Henry an annulment, and they failed. And so Henry steps in and finally says, in the act of supremacy, that I, the King of England, am also going to be the head of my church. And there are several acts that Henry goes to strip away papal power at, and we're not going to go through each one of these. But this is the breaking apart of this globalized network, not really network, but this sort of overarching authority of Christendom. That Christendom and the Pope was able to bring everybody together, and that they were kind of this new Roman Empire through the papacy. But Henry breaks this up, and he's going to create the nation-state model. He's going to say the Pope has no authority over England because England is its own entity, its own territorial, political entity, and I, Henry, am in charge of that, and because the church is here and I am God's servant on earth, I actually am the supreme power here. So this is we see kind of the creation of the nation state, and Henry seizes all the wealth of the church, grants himself a divorce, and they all live happily they live happily ever after, except, well, he has to end up executing Anne Boleyn 2 years later because trumped up charges of adultery. So maybe not so happily ever after. But nevertheless, Henry sets into motion the transformation of a united Christian world to a nation-state model. As he famously declares in the act of supremacy, he says, "This realm of England, it is an empire," meaning he, Henry, is an emperor and he has no second on earth. So this, as I say, begins a revolution in government, as the famous British historian G.R. Elton argues. He says this is a transformation of the old system into something entirely new. This is the birth of nationalism. This is the birth of an English identity. That the government, after the Protestant Reformation, expands, that it begins to do things that it had never done before. Charity was done through the church and through monasteries and this and that. Now the government takes over this role because the government had seized all the monasteries and thrown out all the monks and taken all the wealth. So this welfare paternalism model of a government begins to kind of be adopted here. The bureaucracy is expanded. So Elton argues. I think he has something here. Now, apart from England, the Protestant Reformation begins a period of time that we call the Wars of Religion. And we're not going to go through these really at all. We're just going to simply notate that this is a massive and systemic period of conflicts that were civil wars, that were international wars, that brought in basically the entirety of Europe. And it was fought over religion, it was fought over political control of areas, and it was fought over cultural views, beliefs, practices, and this was done on a global scale. So we can look here and we can see kind of the confessional boundaries of Europe, that what religion resided where, and it's not really clear in many ways, but other than to say, well, it was a mess. So what happens after this is all over and done with at the end of the conclusion of the 30 Years' War, which was a 30-year civil war among Europe where people traveled all over everywhere. This very much smacks of globalized or globalization. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, there's this famous Latin modicum, cuius religio ius religio. His region, his religion. So what does this mean? It means that whoever is the ruler of a particular region, that region is going to take upon that ruler's religion, and that it is going to carve out, instead of a united Christendom, a group of nation states, that a ruler is more important than a united Christianity. And then it is going to take on aspects of nationalism, that this is going to become the ethos of the society, of the state, and it is going to, and the people, the ideology of this state is going to become so powerful that it then leads to nationalism, that you then go from being a Christian first and someone who speaks French in the region of Burgundy second, to you are a Frenchman, or you are a French woman, and you are part of Christianity as second. So when you say, I identify myself as being French, this is really where it comes out of, is the creation of the nation-state model after the Treaty of Westphalia. And within coming out of this is also the legacy of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. So this is a period that questioned ancient knowledge, and people are coming together, that they are trying to understand the world, and they are going to question long accepted wisdom. And they're going to question everything. They're going to question authority, religion, how they know what they know, how they know they exist. And Rene Descartes is famously going to say, I think, therefore I know I am. I only know that I exist because I know I am thinking. They're going to question the role of human relationships. They're going to question this all over Europe. There's going to be a cross-pollination between England, France, and Germany. They're going to come together and they're going to create a new philosophy based upon Enlightenment rationality, that human beings are capable of making the world perfect, that they don't need a deity in order to perfect the world. But then the world wars are going to happen. It's going to throw a real wrench in this argument. But nevertheless, this kind of rationality at the highest levels of intellectual thinking is going to replace theology as kind of the ultimate truth. So this also is coming out of this period of endemic religious warfare. So this is going to conclude our first lecture on European expansion and European religion, and how this age of exploration radically transformed the globalized world, and that it found a world that was participating within this global community in the New World. And then this exchange of ideas and goods and religion, and that it brought about massive and systemic changes in the old and new world, and that globalization was absolutely and unquestionably happening within this time period. So I thank you for watching, and please stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.